Okay, so it's great to be here. It's very good to be here in Kingston, especially. I actually really like Kingston. Um, and my name is Pippin. And what I'm going to do is not give the talk that I proposed entirely. As people tend to do. I'm sure you're used to this, Gabrielle. I apologize. I think this will be better. I was originally going to talk only about this project that you can see here with this Seagull and this Taj Mahal in it. But I'm going to broaden it out a bit because I think that we can get more ideas if we see more stuff. Not quite the bonanza that Sarah gave you yesterday, but sort of mini bonanza of ideas. So what I'm going to do is explore the idea of museums sort of inside video games from a few different perspectives. And particularly, my focus tends to be on how the museum form can help us to look at video games differently and see different aspects of them with different kind of focalizations. But I think, and hopefully this is true in the context of this conference, which is not about video games at all, I'm hoping that there will be some things that come out of these sorts of projects that are interesting and relevant to thinking about digital museums without walls in general. So museums they're near and dear to my heart. I come from New Zealand originally, and my parents are contemporary art collectors there. They're kind of a big deal. And so I grew up in the art world, artists coming to our house, going to endless museum openings. I hated it, obviously. And so there was, despite that teenage rebellion phase that I went through, museums keep pulling me back in. And I keep coming back to them as a really, really interesting premise to work from. Because these days I'm an experimental video game maker. And one of the threads that I've returned to time and time again for a long time, really since I started making games, is this idea of museums and what they can say. So to explore these ideas, what I'm going to do is look at a sequence of projects rather than just the one. We'll have some variety, which is the spice of life. And each one of these projects will center on the idea of museums or presenting art in some kind of specific context in different ways, and I'll try and reflect on that a little bit. So I'll highlight big picture thoughts and little picture thoughts as I go along, and especially think about how setting video games inside museums changes the way that we think about video games, and trying to broaden that out as much as I can. And just as a language note, I'll use the word game and video game a lot in this talk, but I don't mean Assassin's Creed or Bejeweled or the sorts of games that I think easily leap to mind if you're not part of the field in the sort of way that I am. I'm much more interested in the history of the video game form, the technologies that are used to make video games, than I am in specific video games that you might have heard of. And I actually generally try and use the term as a kind of Trojan horse, to sort of sneak art into places where people don't really want it necessarily, like Reddit. Because if you post something and you say, this is a video game, you should check it out, and then it's actually a museum, you get all kinds of attendees at that museum, unwilling, but still they're there, that otherwise maybe wouldn't have looked at that and wouldn't have had the kind of thoughts that you would have in that space. And as a content warning, there are quite a lot of walls in this talk, so be forewarned. So, in 2010, performance artist Marina Abramovic, who I'm sure many or possibly all of you are familiar with, did this work called The Artist is Present at the Museum of Modern Art in New York City. And the work was that she sat in a chair. She didn't always have the table. That went away after a little while. She sat in this chair every day during opening hours for almost 3 months. It's a very long time. And during that time, people were invited to queue in order to sit opposite her, make eye contact, not speak at all, just maintain eye contact with her for as long as they wished. So you could sit there for a couple of minutes or a couple of hours. There was no prescription on what you could do, but you weren't allowed to talk. You weren't allowed to communicate except with your gaze. And it's a classic piece of performance art, right? It's like maybe the performance art in some ways. And it's exactly the kind of thing that tends to frustrate a lot of people who don't necessarily love contemporary art or relational aesthetics, for example. And they say, she's not doing anything, she's just sitting in a chair, I could do that, right? It's a typical response. because they don't really understand what's going on necessarily, or they don't spend the time to think about it. Because of course, despite its sort of static nature, this is really a phenomenal work of endurance, concentration, emotional connection. And the truth is that no, you couldn't do that, right? Only Marina Abramovich can do stuff like this, and a couple of other people. So central to the piece, though, and kind of in the background literally here, is the museum, right? As a space that designates, art is happening here in this space. And maybe that's the most fundamental job of museums in the first place, right? They sort of signify that there's art here, so you know how to distinguish between the art and the stuff outside the museum. Problematic though that can be. It's clear that, if Marina Abramovich did this in a local cafe, for example, it wouldn't have the same resonance. People might not recognize what was going on. The resonance might be a little muffled. So that resonance is partly being created by the museum as a setting. And perhaps carrying over from my sort of life as an art child, I'm very, very interested in that power of museums to create focus and attention and thought in video game spaces, in my case, right? So in 2011, I was in Copenhagen. I was teaching an experimental game design course, having only just learned how to make video games. This is the way that universities work. And in a fit of bravado, I told my students, "Oh, I'm going to make a game of this," because it seemed like, maybe the most absurd thing that you could possibly do. Like the worst video game you could possibly make is a game about sitting in a chair. So in the video game version, you play as somebody who's visiting the performance. You don't play as Marina Abramovich. There's specific reasons for that, which I'll come to. And of course, it all starts with a museum, right? You come to the entrance of the museum. And as I said, this project is interesting to me because it goes against standard principles of game design. It's slow, as we shall see. Not very much happens. You're not the hero. Marina Abramovich, if anybody is the hero, is the hero. And my intuition has always been that breaking those kinds of rules always leads to good things. It leads to new ideas, right? Because people forget that you could do something else. You learn something new, even if it's something terrible. So in the name of authenticity, the museum maintains the same opening hours as the real museum. So you play this on your browser, on your computer. So if you show up after hours, for example, or on Thanksgiving, then it's closed. You can't go in, right? It uses New York's time zone. So if you're in Europe, for example, or somewhere on the other side of the world like New Zealand, it's really problematic to try and get in. You have to wait until midnight or something to go inside the museum. And it's a big hurdle, right, to run into in this video game that you're supposed to be playing. And some people never got in. And they wrote to me and they said, "It was great not getting into your museum. That was a special experience for me." Because the museum was inaccessible, right? It seemed more real. It was like a real experience. Like that's what happens in life. Sometimes places are closed. In video games, places are always open. It's always, you can always do the things that you want to do. With some resistance, but it's always kind of false. And so the museum had a kind of weight or realism that it wouldn't have had if it was always open for people to attend. It made you feel like you were really there. It's kind of, instead of a convenient fiction of a video game, it was an inconvenient fiction. Eventually, though, the museum does open at 10:30, Wednesdays through Mondays, closed Christmas and Thanksgiving. And you head in and you buy a ticket in the ticket hall. You have to pay the authentic admission price of $25, which is shocking to some people. I'm sure it's more by now. But you don't have to Venmo me the money or anything. It's free. It's just fake video game money. And after showing your ticket, you're then free to head into the exhibition spaces. You hand your ticket to the guard, of course, because there's security is part of museums as well. And you walk through the hallways of MoMA. You walk past these sort of pixelated versions of famous artworks by Van Gogh or Andy Warhol or Matisse, etc. Again, trying to add to this idea that you're really in this space, and to show that there are other things besides your goal that you might pay interest in. Eventually, you find this queue of people, right? They're just standing there in the middle of the hallway. And if you stand behind them, you find out that you've joined the queue to see this performance work. And depending on whether you're already familiar with the original artwork, you may or may not have any idea, what you're waiting for. You just joined a queue. And so the game asks an important question here, which is aligned, I think, with one of the questions that the original performance asks, which is like, is this worth it? Is it worth waiting in line for the experience at the other end? Obviously, queues imply that it is worth it. Like, people queue because there's something that they either need or want, like a brunch or something like that at the other end of the queue, the rainbow of the queue. And similarly, I think the museum space heavily implies as well, like, there's valuable stuff here. Like, this is culturally sanctioned, excellent things that you should want to queue for. It's virtuous to stand in this queue. And then finally, video games themselves, of course, double down on this pressure to join the queue, because in a video game, there's generally this promise that it's not going to waste your time, right? Anything that you can do in a video game, in some sense, you should do, because if it's been implemented by the developers, then they wanted you to try and do it, or they thought you might try and do it. So in some sense, you should join this queue. But as you can see, it takes a really long time, like a really long time, most of the time, to see anything happening. It just looks like a picture. Because the queue moves on average only about once every 20 minutes, which is a very long time when you're sitting on your computer. I researched the average times that people sat with Marina Abramović in the original, and tried to make sure that the game matched that average, but that it also matched the huge variance in the amounts of time that people sat. So a lot of people, I think, would sit for sort of between 2 and 5 minutes, let's say. It's a lot of pressure on you because you're sitting there on this chair and everybody's looking at you and you're having the experience that everybody wants. And Marina's very intense as well. Maybe it's too much for you. But a couple of people sat with her for 8 hours. They just got there first, and then they just sat with her for the entire day. And plenty of people sat for an hour, 4 hours, etc. So this is implemented in the game as well. So you have no idea how long it's going to take to move up one space in the queue. So given that you're maybe getting bored, you might leave the queue to go and see what the fuss is all about. And you walk to the front of the queue and you see, oh, so it's a chance to sit in a chair eventually opposite this woman in a red dress. Again, you may or may not know who she is. And so again, the key value proposition comes up, right? The existential question, like, what is this worth to me? What will it be like? Why is it considered valuable? Do I have the endurance to find out now that I know that it's going to take a time investment? And then layered on top of these sorts of more personal questions are video gamey questions like, surely this game does not actually expect me to stand in a queue for this long. But if I did stand in a queue, would the payoff actually be super amazing? And I should do it because I want to know what it's like. Video gamers are very much like that. What's the ratio of value to time for a video game experience or a museum experience? Is this even a video game in the first place? People often shout that at me on the streets. What is going on? But maybe you do go and wait, like I did when I played my own game. Somebody had to. And the weird thing about it is that the waiting is really exciting. I promise you. You have to try it because it doesn't sound true. But it's very exciting because the game is designed to make it very, very active. So in the way the game is made, you can't leave, right? So the obvious thing would be get in the queue, go make lunch, come back, see what's happening. But if the queue moves up and you're not moving up with it, then the people just walk past you and you just end up out of the queue again. So you can't just go away, you have to be there. You can't just keep hitting the key that moves you forwards in the queue, because the game interprets that as kind of shoving the person in front of you very aggressively, and you are ejected by security, which is, again, very museum-y kind of experience, right? The sort of security theater of museums. And so these, again, are sort of attempts to align the video game with a real experience, with a sort of museum experience. Because video games often aim for sort of extremes of, convenience and power. You're the most important person in the world. But setting a video game in a museum gives me the opportunity to, push back on those values and make you sort of powerless and things are inconvenient for you. You're just another person. Even the person that you are represented as in the game is randomly generated at the start. It has no special features. You might have long hair, short hair, different colored t-shirt. Everybody mostly wears black at these things, though. So you have this very intense experience of waiting, just waiting to move up, waiting to sit. It's very panicky whenever the queue moves because you don't want to mess up and accidentally leave the queue. So you have to pay attention, right? And that's the point. This is what Marina Abramović's work is partly about too, right? It's being present in your body, paying attention to what's around you. This game is trying to do that just from a different perspective. So it's the real thing. And of course you can reach the front of the queue, and you can sit with Marina, and something amazing happens, by the way. But you can play that for yourself and find out. So one of the wonderful things I think about these digital presentations of art or sort of online museums is this accessibility thing, right? Like it's definitely more accessible, pending issues of technology and access to technology. That remains a thing. But one thing that can get lost in the excitement is sort of broader thinking about what it means to present these things online in a digital form, which is something we're discussing a lot at this conference, of course. And so one of the easy things that we still see people reaching for is just like, oh, I can put a series of extremely high resolution JPEGs on the internet, and that's the museum, and you can look at them, and it's very detailed. And that's important. That allows you to see things that you couldn't see before. But it does drop away a lot of what the museum space contributes to the experience of art, shared space, that sort of shared context and pressure to look like you are paying attention. Even the inconvenience of a museum adds to the way that you spend your time with the art. So in the game there, you don't just see a series of pictures of the performance or a video, right? You're being asked to commit to the actual time scale and trials of waiting. And that's another way that we can do things, right? It's to figure out ways to make the experience interactive, not just about only looking, but also about feeling. So for all its low fidelity, I think it really gets at some of the underlying nature of the work in a way that non-interactive presentations often struggle to do. So carrying on that theme of accessibility, this is Ziv Schneider's The Museum of Stolen Art, which is one of those kind of, we've got a museum space and it's got JPEGs, PNGs, some file format on the wall. So replicating a fairly traditional museum setup. And I think it's a great example of that kind of utopian view that this is sort of like one way that we can give access to art, is just to kind of completely replicate the experience in an online 3D world. So per their description, quote, the Museum of Stolen Art is a virtual space for art that has been stolen or looted. So these are artworks that aren't available in the world. Lost to greed or conflict. It's a virtual reality experience where one can enjoy artwork that is otherwise hidden. So that's the idea behind this. And I think it's a really interesting premise, right? That we've got a digital museum that exhibits work that you can't see because there's only pictures of it remain. Is this different to a website with pictures of those artworks? That's an interesting question, right? I think that there's a lot of discussion that we could have about that. What's the value of seeing it this way rather than in some other way? So I saw this museum in 2015, and I wanted to make some kind of response because I thought it was an interesting idea to think about work that you can't see in the real world. And so I made my own place. It's called the Stolen Art Gallery. Less grand. It's just a small gallery, dealer gallery maybe. That doesn't make sense because you can't buy anything. And I wanted to kind of push on this idea of how do you represent things that you can't see in the real world? How do you sort of communicate about them? So what else could we do? So in the Stolen Art Gallery, it similarly exhibits stolen art, portraiture specifically. It's like a specific kind of thematic show, but it does it in a different way. So I really wanted to embrace sort of museum signifiers. So you've got the kind of gallery, classic white cubey gallery space. There's the gallery name above the door. There's the list of artists on the wall. There's the classic wall text with some interpretive writing. I don't know how legible that is, but I'll read a little bit of it. A stolen portrait is a kidnapping. I wrote this. I'm very proud of it. The person we knew so well is gone, and we only have photographs and other insufficient facsimiles to remind us of their eyes, their lips, or the line of their jaw. Missing Persons brings together portraiture from the Federal Bureau of Investigation's National Stolen Art File. It's the same source that Ziv Schneider used, I believe, as well. I actually don't like the rest of that text. I'm not going to read it. What I was most interested in, right, so there's these trappings of the museum experience, the gallery experience, but I wanted to think about how the architecture could speak to this idea of stolen artworks. And so the way that it works in this gallery is literally the stuff's not there, right, because it got stolen. So you can't see it. There's just empty plinths, empty walls with labels that tell you what would have been there had it not been stolen by somebody. So less information density in terms of actually kind of being able to experience it, but an interesting way to try and get at the resonance of what it means for an artwork to be gone, right? To not try and pretend, well, it's still sort of here, so it's sort of like, it's not so bad. But to embrace the tragedy a little bit, I guess. And so the museum sort of gallery space itself, the sort of virtual space that we have here, kind of steps into the foreground, right? Because there's nothing else to look at. And tells the story of stolen artworks through emptiness, like through the space that's carved out by them being gone. And I think one of the great things, sort of returning to that question of accessibility, is, this sort of exhibition, you pitch this to, I don't know, Museum of Modern Art, just to use a random example, they're probably not going to do it, right? Like having an empty museum or an empty gallery space is not a super popular idea for a gallery show. I'm sure it's been done. But in a virtual space, you can come up with something like this and just do it, right? You don't have to ask for permission particularly because there's nothing there, again. You can just do it and you can see how it feels. You don't have to wonder what that would be like. So digital architecture, I think, is one place to really look closely when we're thinking about these sorts of ideas of digital museums, is not just what's inside them, but like how do we sculpt and shape the spaces that we use to display them in virtually. So in this case, the spatial form was drawing attention to absence, right? And the sheer kind of affordability of virtual spaces, you don't have concrete, you don't have plaster, you can't accidentally like break the floor or something. It allows us to experiment and be much wilder with the kinds of shows that we could imagine putting up architecturally as well as in terms of content. So after making that project, I became pretty obsessed with one line of my thinking was all about 3D spaces and how do we look at them and think about them in interesting ways, where we look at the space itself or the technology itself instead of using it to present something else and letting it recede into the background. And so that led me to the spooky door of this artist, Gregor Schneider, who's one of my favorite installation artists. He's terrifying. So he's preoccupied with architecture and space, and he makes works that revolve around duplication, disorientation, erasure, and visibility. I strongly recommend looking him up if you're not familiar. And so this room here is one of his works, the whole room, not just the mattress and so forth. The room is called UR1, and it's part of this larger work he made called Totes Haus UR, Dead House UR in German. And that larger work revolves around this house that he inherited as a teenager. He got to work on it right away. He's special. And he spent a huge amount of his artistic career kind of renovating the house in very peculiar ways. Building walls in front of other walls, building walls in front of windows, embedding things in the walls that you can't see but can only maybe sense in some psychic way. There's a room that rotates on its own axis so that you don't step out in the same place that you stepped in. And much more. So that's what he does. That's the art, is these strange spaces. So here's UR1 again. UR1 is particularly special because it's one of the rooms that Schneider has reproduced more than once. So one of his most fascinating practices is that he'll take a space and then make it again, and try to make it as exactly the same as he possibly can. So instead of making something that seems very new, he's trying to make something that is just exactly the same thing as the old thing. All of the perfections and imperfections in the walls, like a dent in the power plug, all of that he reproduces through obsessive documentation. And that idea of replication is like probably at the heart of his practice, I would say. One of his works even involves duplicating an entire house. He did this in London. There was like a one-row house. You would go in, look around. There's like creepy people in the kitchen and stuff as well. But for the purposes of now, it doesn't matter. It's like the whole house, right? You can go upstairs into the bedroom. There's a guy in a plastic bag. And then you leave, and then the tour guide leads you down the street, and you go into another house, and it's exactly the same. Which, I mean, it gives me chills. I know about it, and it gives me chills just thinking about that. That sort of dislocation in time and space that experience would create, right? So uncanny to see the same thing transported in space when you know it couldn't have been. So I made this game called VR1 as a sort of tribute to Schneider, or a response to his practice of duplication and manipulation of space. And as you can see, the baseline is a sort of 3D replication of that room, UR1, with the radiator and the bed and the weird poster tube. I don't know what that is. I haven't seen this work in person. This is all through photos. And it's made in the Unity game engine. And so in its sort of basic incarnation here, the game is sort of like a museum in a sense, right? It gives you a chance to go into the room UR1, look around, and be in the space. But of course, it doesn't have the same fidelity that Schneider's work. So it's pretty imperfect as well. But it's got lots of good stuff about it, right? You don't have to travel to the Venice Biennale or wherever that room is. You can just load it up in your browser. But one of the big flaws about my UR1 room, right, is that the digital format is really incompatible with Schneider's main principle of duplication and replication, because it's too easy. In a game engine like Unity, if I wanted to make that room again, I would literally just, like in Microsoft Word, right, copy, paste, stick it, done. Like, that's not very satisfying for me, or presumably for a person looking at this, because they know that it didn't take me any effort. So in VR1, I was trying to respond to that, to think of other ways that I could relate to Schneider's work, present Schneider's work in a new context. And so it ends up being a series of variations on the space of UR1, but focused on the kinds of crafts and techniques that are available in a game engine, like Unity. So, for example, there's a version of the room where all of the objects are floating slightly in the air as a sort of tribute to Schneider's idea of the uncanny. You know, something you can do in a video game. I think Schneider would struggle to achieve this effect in his own architecture. So finding ways to make the game correspond to the spirit of the work that it's presenting without actually being able to duplicate the exact thing. Another version has all of the components of the room presented in order of size. So the biggest walls are over to the left, going all the way down to sort of the radiator and the door handle and stuff like that. Echoing Schneider's ideas of sort of deconstruction and reconstruction of spaces. This idea that a game engine spaces are always reconfigurable, malleable, changeable. It's a different way of seeing the same room. And of course, you can duplicate the room. You can duplicate the room in kind of interesting ways in a game engine. For instance, you can place it window to window so that the window becomes a mirror, right? So you look through, the other room is flipped on its axis as well. And so it's like a mirror you can look through, but you can walk into the mirrored room as well. Obviously, directly speaking to Schneider's idea of duplication. And the room might just be a kind of literal death trap as well, because that's something Schneider's pretty into. So instead of a floor, there's just an abyss, and you fall to your death out of the room. That sense of menace and danger is a big part of what Schneider does, so this is a way of trying to express that in the sense of a game engine, where you can just, again, take out the floor and it's gone, and you fall through it. That's what happens. So there's 17 in total. I'm not going to go through all of them. And they sort of accumulate ideas about digital architecture, right, in the context of Schneider's practice. As a way to engage in those ideas, to help people be interested in Schneider, but also to help people be interested in Unity. And this is the final room, by the way. It ends on a very Schneiderian note, which is that you're in the room at the beginning, and the door is locked, and you can't leave. And so that's it for you. You're stuck. And this is like literally a work that Schneider, I don't know if he's actually built this or he just contemplated it, but he had this room that he wanted to make where if you walk in, the door closes automatically and locks, and it's pitch black, and it's sound insulated so nobody can hear you screaming. You also can't scream in my game. There's no scream button. Yeah, and that's it. So he's a disturbing guy. So as well as giving access to Schneider's work, the playing of the game is also inviting you to consider not just the ideas that Schneider is interested in, but the qualities of the underlying game engine and the qualities of 3D space. The things that we can really take for granted, right, because they tend to be presented in a mostly realistic fashion. So in playing the game, you think explicitly about how 3D spaces are constructed, how malleable they are, how they're rendered on the screen. And I think that just points to this idea that digital museums don't have to, remediate physically plausible exhibitions, right? It doesn't have to be a room and there's stuff on the walls and then there's stuff on a plinth. You can also use these spaces to help people to look kind of under the hood of how the thing was made in the first place. The tools that were used to create these worlds. But old school formal exhibitions are awesome too. I love them. And museum and exhibition contexts in all their glory, they're still a really great way to make space for art and to create this context for looking. And I strongly believe in that. It's something that I try and practice. And so this is Donald Judd's 100 Untitled Works in Mill Aluminum. I would say aluminium, because I'm not from the United States. And it's 100 aluminum boxes with identical exterior dimensions. So they all have the same basic exterior form, but they have unique dividing elements inside of them. So there's sort of lengthwise divisions, diagonal, etc., such that every one of the 100 boxes is unique in its internal structure. And so the cumulative effect is this kind of systematic meditation on sculptural possibility within this very limited, extremely formal shape. And for Judd, that's also in conversation with the environment, right? So the way that the light comes in, especially through these huge windows, and illuminates them and shines off the surfaces, that's all super important to this work as well. The place, the museum itself. And it's in the desert. It's in Marfa, Texas. If you ever get the chance to go, it's quite an experience at the Chinati Foundation, which has got a lot of other great stuff in it as well. So inspired by Judd, I decided to take on the sort of same presentation approach, this idea of like a whole lot of cubes with variations, but to apply it to this idea that I was building up of thinking about the game engine as something that you can exhibit instead of something that just supports the exhibition. And so we have VR2, the sequel to VR1, so we're still thinking about the same sorts of ideas, so I decided to make a sequel. And as you can see, it's very minimalist, more minimal even than Judd's work, which is saying something. So in this case, the artillery sheds are filled with row upon row of this shape that anybody who's ever used a game engine will recognize as like the most basic, fundamental shape in 3D modeling, which is a cube. That's what you start with. Sort of in the beginning, there was the cube. It's incredibly generic. It has no texturing. It's just the cube. That's just it. That's all there is. But the cubes aren't empty. So VR2 has the same idea of Judd's formal variations, but it turns its focus onto specific elements of the game engine at a really like under the hood kind of level, right? Which is that Unity has a menu, it's called the game object menu, that contains a list of every single kind of thing that you could put into a game according to Unity. You can see them listed here. So there's all kinds of stuff like a 3D model of a horse you could put in. You can put in a cube, obviously. You can put in sound. You can put in wind. You can put in a movie. You can put in a person who can run around, etc. And all of those things are in this game. They're just inside the cubes, which was a bad idea. But I'm still find this a very interesting game. But I think I got overexcited about Gregor Schneider because one of his projects is this idea of hiding things inside walls and then thinking about the psychic effects, which I think is nonsense. But I really like it as an idea. And so I wanted to do the same thing, right? So all of the things that you could possibly have in Unity, like the horse and the webcam, etc., they're inside the cube, so you can't see them. So they're not displayed by this museum. They're sort of hidden from you by this museum. Was that a good idea? I don't think so. I'm actually thinking I might remake the game, but I'll make it like VR5 or something so that I get more credit for making something new. But I think it's still interesting, right? There's still this sort of weird ontological question about whether the thing is there or not, and I think that's interesting to think about in a video game. Like, is the horse inside the cube? Can we tell? Like, in a video game especially, in a technological context, if the horse is never going to be seen by the player, does the game engine even, is it there? Like, if you play the game, does the game engine bother to put the horse inside the cube, or is it just not there because the game engine knows that it can't be seen? I don't know. So there's these sort of weird existential questions. One of the big ones that I wasn't expecting is that people didn't believe that the things were in there. They doubted me, which is so offensive. But they were like, oh, they're just not in there. It's just cubes, right? But those things, they are in there. They really are. It's just you can't see them. And if you look at the information sheet, you can sort of pick a thing like the sound of rain, which is in box I, and you can walk over to it. And at least in my, like I'm unusual, but I like the idea of standing in front of this cube and contemplating, what does it mean for the sound of rain to be inside this cube? You can't hear it. Obviously, you can't see the sound of rain. That sounds like a Zen koan. You can just think about the software and what it would mean to have sound inside of a cube that cannot be perceived. So at the very least, what we have here is sort of classical signifiers of an art institution, right? The direct homage to an artist like Donald Judd, the organized presentation of the work in this kind of grid space, and the well-lit kind of environment that it's in, the information sheet that tells you these things are being presented as artworks. But here all of this is being directed towards the game engine itself, saying, look at the game engine, look at what it can do, think about what it can do. So I think that although hiding things, again, was maybe a mistake, I think that there's a huge amount of value to directing people's focus inward into the game, rather than to the surface. So what really excited me about that game was that kind of formal variations idea that came from Judd, less so the Schneider thing. I really believe in the power of showing different configurations of the same thing, because I think it's a really special way to get at the idea of process, right? The artist's process, how an artist selects from possibilities and you see the final work, but you don't necessarily see all of the work that it took to get there. And having these kind of configurations presented is one way that you can maybe get a little bit closer to that mindset. You can see what was possible. And so in keeping with this, I made another game structured in the same way, called VR3, of course. But this one is about reflecting on water. I'm going to speed up a tiny bit. I'm looking at the time. And as a bonus, this stuff is not hidden. You can actually see the water. So that's nice. And because water is a really big deal in video games, kind of unnaturally so, it's kind of like regarded as this huge technical benchmark. The more realistic the water in a video game, the more impressed everybody is by the programmers, right? But if you're a player and you're playing a video game, you usually just don't look at it, right? Because you're on a horse and you're like going somewhere else and you splash through the water and the water's just kind of in your way. You're drowning and you don't like the water, but you certainly don't really sort of look at it with a lot of interest. So the water is very peripheral normally in a video game. It's not in the center of your focus. You don't often stop to look at it. So this game was about stopping to look at it. So you're given the kind of space where you are asked to stop and look at things, which is a museum. So we have these plinths, as you can see, and each one has some water in it. And all of the waters are different kinds of water. It's called third-party water. It's water that was produced by various creators, such as my friends Robert Yang and Paolo Petticini from Mole Industria. They sort of gave me some water to put into the museum. You always got to exhibit your friends if you're curating a show. But then a lot of the other water, as we can see here, for instance, I actually bought. So this water cost $3. Make of that what you will. And the labels on the plinth give you sort of details about that, right? Like the artist, the materials, the year of production, what it cost if it cost something, etc. Treating the water as a sculptural form. So in the gallery, there's all of these different kinds of waters, and this layout really invites you to compare things, right? Because you're seeing all of these different instances of the same thing, water. Naturally, you're going to ask yourself questions about, well, is this water better than this water? Which water makes you feel a certain way? Which one makes you feel like you're at the beach? Which one makes you feel like you're in hell? Like there's waters of all kinds, for all kinds of purposes. And this is a space where you can actually think about that. Again, kind of entering the mind of the artist or the game designer, right, who makes these decisions. It invites you to make those decisions. So you can really speculate about what different kinds of waters do and how they do it. So the game is an instrument for you to think about a very, very specific technological element of game production for yourself. It's a museum for you to think about how games are made. And to see, I think, how even tiny pieces of the puzzle have this huge influence on the final outcome, right, if you actually pay attention. There's a second gallery, and this one has just one kind of water, which is the water that comes with the Unity game engine. It's called Pro Water, professional water, which is a cool idea. And in this gallery, it did some very unprofessional things while I was working with it, actually, but we won't talk about that. It's got the same layout, same idea, except that this time, because there's just one water, what you're seeing is different parameterizations of the same thing. So in the left-hand column in the room, there's a water called simple water, then there's reflective water in the middle column, and then there's refractive water in the right-hand column. These are all different sort of levels of technical sophistication with how the water behaves physically when you look at it. And then in the rows, there's different parameters like how fast the waves move, how big the waves are, how much looking into it will distort the reflections or not. And all of this stuff is stuff that you, if you were making a game, you would want to tune these parameters to make the water just the right way for what you're trying to achieve, right? And so again, now you can kind of go and look at them all in a group and think, well, which is the water that I want right now in my life? So it's another exercise in contemplation, right? Like thinking about the stories that different kinds of water can tell. But in the end, it was kind of like the money thing that really jumped out at me from VR3, right? I don't know if you saw one of those waters. It was like $19 and it just like a flat piece of crap. There are reasons why it was expensive and yet didn't look very impressive, to do with mobile technology and running on different kinds of computers, but it's vastly overpriced. But the thing about money and showing how much something cost in that game was that was always the focal point of conversation when I talked to people about it or read anything about the game online. It's like, people are angry about why this water costs this much, or like, look at this one's free and it's way better than this one, or this one's beautiful but it's only $1, etc. And it reminded me that money is this great conversation starter, right? It really gets people invested. Like, people have passionate feelings about what things cost, which is very bourgeois and capitalist, but it still starts a conversation, which I think is a huge, it's one of the purposes, again, of museums and of showing these things to people, is to not just say, there it is, and they're like, nice, but to like start thinking about it and to have feelings and opinions about it, to critique it. And so cost is something that everyone has an opinion on, especially in the realm of art, right? Good grief. So showing them this way was a way to start this conversation. We won't even get started on NFTs, obviously. That's for another day. But those ideas from VR3 led to my most recent project, which I think I'm okay for time, so I won't rush myself. But they led me to this place here, which is the Unity Asset Store. Because these days, video game creation, a huge amount of what happens when you make a video game, and this is very new comparatively to the history of making games, is that a lot of the time you're going to be getting the sort of component pieces of your game from other people on the internet, like an online marketplace, right? So you need a horse, so you buy a horse. You need some water, so you buy some water. You don't make the water yourself, because that's very time consuming. And often other people are just better at it than you are. So an asset is the name for one of these things that you incorporate into your game, the horse or the water. And this is the Unity Asset Store, which is the marketplace for the Unity game engine, which is the one that I tend to use. And you can buy everything, right? So landscapes, music, explosions, just like almost anything you can think of is there. And these things are worth something. There are some that are free, but the vast majority of these things cost money to buy. And so this final project kind of all started when I bought the Sahara Desert. And it cost $4.99. And I thought it was just so beautiful. Right? It's very beautiful. It's lovely to be out in the desert, and you can see all of those beautiful ripples on the dunes and the kind of disappearing off into the horizon. And I thought, oh, all of this for only $4.99. That is a good deal. I am happy about that. You can see, I should attribute it as well. It's by Black Sun Productions from 2016. I've got the attributions for all of the assets up there. And so inspired by that desert, I started working on a kind of my own Chinati Foundation, like a museum in the desert for showing art in. But instead of Donald Judd, I have 3D models that I bought on the Unity Asset Store. So I took the desert and I kind of ran with that idea. I'm going to put stuff in this desert. Look on my works ye mighty, etc. And it turns out that $4.99 is the lowest price that you can charge for something on the Unity Asset Store, which actually surprises me. But I think they're trying to avoid that kind of race to the bottom of the App Store and stuff on phones. And so I decided what I would do is everything I would buy would cost $4.99, and that would be the thing that kind of glued everything together. It would be the comparison point that you could use to have kind of thoughts and opinions about the different kinds of objects that you would find there. And so the game is a sequel to VR3, and I felt very clever when I realized I could call it VR $4.99. So that's what it is. So we've got two examples from every deepest category in the Unity Asset Store in the 3D sort of super category. So it's all 3D models. So it's kind of like a digital Noah's Ark, right? Two from each of these sort of species. So you've got everything from reptiles to historic buildings to trees to abstract shapes for prototyping, and all in this desert that you can go and have a look at. So the last thing I want to do is just sort of take a walk through this desert quickly. This one's hard to miss, obviously. It's the Taj Mahal, $4.99 worth of it. You can see it from almost everywhere. It's to scale, so it's really big. It's a very big building in person. And it's by Chandan Kumar Singh, as you can see. So all of these things have an informational plinth, of course. Like this is the key way that I'm able to evoke that kind of museum-y idea. Like this is an artwork. This is not just the Taj Mahal happens to be in the Sahara today. So it has the title, Taj Mahal by Chandan Kumar Singh. Its category, so 3D models, environments, historic. A version, a date, the size of the assets, an interesting feature of these things, is 136 megabytes. This game is so big, it's disastrous. It's like 5 gigabytes now, or 6 or 7. It's just disgustingly large. And of course, it costs $4.99. You can also see, just by the by, there's a lot of infrastructure that's involved in exhibiting things in a desert. Like I had to build a massive plinth to put under the Taj Mahal, because you can't put it on the desert because it's wavy, and like otherwise it would be kind of sinking. And then I felt like I'm kind of saying something about a post-apocalyptic kind of Planet of the Apes in India sort of situation. I didn't want to do that, so it's on a plinth. But that's very museum-y, so that's good. But the plinth is massive because the Taj Mahal is massive, so then you have to have stairs. So I sort of found myself not just kind of creating and curating the space, but also being a museum technician, which I always think is a really interesting aspect of working on these projects. You have to do everything. There's nobody to help you, because I won't work with anyone. So when you encounter the Taj Mahal, you have all of these sorts of questions, right? Like, especially you've just seen the desert. You know, the desert cost $4.99. So how did they compare? How do you even compare a desert to a Taj Mahal? It might help to know that the desert is only 1 square kilometer, only 1 square kilometer of the Sahara Desert. So, well, maybe the Taj is better. It's like very complex. It's beautiful. It's a recognizable piece of architecture. The desert is kind of more nondescript, right? You might not know it's the Sahara unless somebody tells you that. But the desert's really special because you can walk on it. You can be in it, like I'm in the desert. Whereas, in fact, the Taj Mahal is completely insubstantial. You can just walk through it. It has no kind of collision. The walls are completely insubstantial. But then the Taj Mahal is 100 megabytes bigger than the Sahara Desert, so maybe that means that it's more valuable, right? So it's difficult to make a decision, but the important thing is that you're encouraged to think about those things. Which one would you buy? It obviously depends, right? And that's the idea. That's the game in a nutshell, right? Have these kinds of thoughts. Invite people into the desert to think about the significance of these kinds of objects. Which, again, if we saw the Taj Mahal in a game, or the desert for that matter, we wouldn't really look at it for very long because we'd be busy doing something else, like shooting the people in the Taj Mahal, shooting the people in the desert. That would be much more important to us. But here we can't do any of those things. We can only pay attention. So here's 2 columns of animals, very Noah's Ark, confronting each other across this ridge of a sand dune. And to the left is Animal Pack Deluxe version 2 by Janpek. You can see that they're animated, they're very realistic. It's got 2 elephants at the front, kind of doing their thing, looking elephanty, looking around. And then to the right, we've got these less detailed, completely static, low polygon animals, just standing there. There is an elephant, don't worry. There's an elephant, sort of 3 from the front. And so you have like a direct comparison issue here, right? Like they're the same thing. It's like 2 sets of animals that you could buy, spend $4.99 on either one. And so which one would you buy? And again, it depends, right? They're kind of the same thing, but they're not the same thing, right? We've seen many, many differences, like the deluxe pack. It's like named in a way to make you kind of want to get it, I guess. Deluxe, luxury animals. It's animated, so that's already a point in its favor. They're very detailed. You can look at the wrinkly skin on the elephant, etc. It has 3 elephants, not just 2. That's special. But the low poly animals are low poly for a reason, right? They're low poly because they're smaller. Your game will run faster if you have a low poly animal. It's a stylistic choice to have a low poly game that has things in it that look like the things on the right. So if you bought a super realistic elephant and put it in that game, it would look ridiculous. So you wouldn't do that. So again, you have to ask these sorts of questions. You have to ask yourself to sort of think like an artist, right? Like, what do I need for this project, this hypothetical project that I'm kind of building while I walk around in this desert? And so speaking of artists, this is my favorite artist from the Unity Asset Store, Maxim Bugrimov. This is Humanoid Creatures Pack. I'm loath to speed up too much just because this is one of the most beautiful things you will ever see. These are these sort of super creepy ghoul things. And they kind of look like they're dancing in Magic Mike XXL or something like that, right? They're like very energetic, very sort of fit, not necessarily sexy, but they're kind of cool. They're doing their thing, and what they're really doing is just running through every animation that they come with. So it's, again, they're kind of demonstrating their value. It's just that when they're all chained together like this, it ends up looking kind of like a dance, right? And Maxim Bugrimov, I follow his work. He's got like 270 different things on the asset store, like these 5 Stalin statues, which I find mesmerizing. I have not yet bought them. Or Dead Man in a Bag, and a kind of shout out back to Gregor Schneider, who did almost exactly this in one of his artworks. Don't know what I would use that for. So I'm a big fan of Maxim Bugrimov. I love his oeuvre, but really the biggest thing about it for me is these monsters and their dancing, right? Because when you go to the asset store, as I'm going through, kind of exploring what I want to buy, this is what you see. And it's even better than my game, right? Just a gray background, and then they just start kind of doing their thing. It just needs a bit of music, and it would just be so fun. They're so joyful. I guess that's the thing that I like about them. They're hideous and joyful. So I bought them. Just one last thing. So this is a plinth, and as you can see, the plinth, the text there says that it's Seagull, Laris Canis by Junichi Suko. And it's a very complicated story, this one. I put it in. It's not just a seagull. It's a great little seagull. But as you can see, it's not there And the reason it's not there is because when I installed it and I ran off to go and have a look, it wasn't there. And the reason it wasn't there is because you actually control it. I didn't know this, but it's controlled by exactly the same keys and inputs as the person visiting the museum. So when you come to the museum, you're not just you're a seagull as well, and you don't know that. So you kind of steer the seagull off the plinth before you get there. And I agonized about this for a long time. I was like, maybe I need to build a wall, like curation thinking, right? Like build a wall so that it can't get off, or just disable its input altogether, trap it in some other way, make it walk in circles. I tried to do that for a while. Very difficult. My math is not strong enough. And in the end, my wife really saved me. She was just like, just let the seagull be a seagull. It's fine. Like, it's part of what it is, so it should just be allowed to be itself. And I think that that's great because it illuminates what is valuable and important about the seagull, which is that it's interactive. It's got kind of this essence that a lot of the other things don't have. It's you as well, right? So it's kind of a self-interest to enjoy the seagull. And it creates this amazing sequence of feelings, I think, which is you get to the exhibition. At some point you find the seagull area. The seagull is not there. You have to ask yourself, like, where is the seagull? Why is the seagull not there? Then you maybe read the informational plinth that tells you that it's controlled by exactly the keys that you've been pressing for the last sort of 10 minutes. Mm-hmm. And you realize why it's not there, and then maybe you have to go looking for it, but it moves when you move, so it's very difficult to find. I almost never find it. It's like a little detective story. But just for you, and to kind of wind up, through presentation magic, this is a video, not a real thing. Here is the seagull, just so you can see it, because otherwise you might miss on it. And it's just like a standard little seagull like you would see in Kingston. Oh, that's about it. I'm finished. These were the sort of the big ideas. I'm going to cut myself off. I have many, many more things that I could say about these big ideas. I'm happy to talk about them with anybody. But for now, thanks.